Welcome back to another episode of Capes and Tights. I'm your host, Justin Soderberg. This is a comic book and pop culture podcast. Today, we have a guest author of a book called American Comics, A History, Jeremy Dauber, joining us on the podcast. We talked all kinds of the gauntlet of comic books in general, but mostly about his book, which is available now on Amazon.com or anywhere you can buy your books in this world, basically. Jeremy wrote this book over a span of about 4 years, and it was released on November 2nd, 2021. So make sure you check that out. I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis on who Jeremy is before we get started with this podcast. So Jeremy Dauber is a professor of Jewish literature and American studies at Columbia University, where he has also served as director of its Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies. He's received undergraduate degree from summa cum laude from Harvard and his doctorate from the University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. Jeremy is the author of a number of books, including today's topic, American Comics: A History. He frequently lectures on topics related to American pop culture, Jewish literature, history, humor at venues around the United States and internationally. Jeremy was a great conversationalist and great podcast, so make sure you check out his book, American Comics: A History, available on Amazon, anywhere you can buy books nowadays. Make sure you follow Jeremy at jeremydauber.com. It's Jeremy, DAUBER.com, as well as on Facebook. I can't say this right, on Twitter. And follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Capes and Tights Podcast, and on Twitter at Capes Tights Pod. Capesandtights.com, and anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find us to download, subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff. So this is our interview and conversation with Jeremy Dauber of American Comics: A History. Check it out. Enjoy. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to the podcast, Jeremy. How are you?
Great. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to jump on here with us and talk your book and just talk comic books and life in general. How is life? You're in New York City. Is that where? Am I correct about that?
That's right. You're finding me in New York City, so that's where I live with my family, and we're excited. We got to see the book in person in an actual bookstore, so that was a lot of fun.
I mean, it must be somewhat. I mean, you have a couple of books out there now, so it must be boring at this point, right? When you see your book on the shelf.
Well, it's always a thrill, but my kids are very little, so they don't really remember the last time the last one came out. So it's my 3-year-old keeps trying to grab the books down from the shelves in the bookstore and
try not to pay for them. But no, that's my dad's book. Don't worry, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
I know that guy.
Yeah.
So just to get started here, I mean, how did you get into writing? What's the story behind getting into being an author?
Well, my day job is as a professor at the Columbia University, and part of the requirements of the job were to write some books, and I discovered that I actually liked writing them. And as I got sort of further on in my career, I said, I'm going to start teaching courses about things that I think are both quite important and things that I also love. And I make a joke with my family that like the 12-year-old in me is extremely happy about the career that I've taken. As maybe, that may be the case with you as well, but like to be able to talk about these things that we loved growing up and to teach, in my case, to teach a class on them, it was just really a wonderful opportunity. And I was really very lucky because I've been teaching this class at Columbia for the last 10 years with Paul Levitz, who is for people who don't know, who might be listening, the former president of DC Comics, really was every aspect of the business in one way or another. And he and I learned a lot from him. He might have learned one or two things from me, I don't know. But together we developed this class, and and at some point I said, wow, I think there's a book in this because it really tells the story, American comics, of America over the last certainly 100, 150 years. And I also thought that there was a way of telling the story that combined a lot of the interest in superhero comics and mainstream comics with a lot of the interest in, let's call them sort of alternative or independent comics, what some people call graphic novels, although of course we know there's graphic novels on all sides. And really all of that be part of one large story. And that was the kind of thing that I wanted to tell in the book. And, that's what happened. So the book is now out.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that too. Beginning of November, it hit the shelves, and we're excited. I said I talked before we started recording. I skimmed through the advanced copy that I got, and it's well written. I did read the intro. I skimmed across a couple of those chapters to get some idea of your writing and so on, and it covers a lot. And so my question really is like, how did comics become part of your? I know we talked about writing here a second ago, but like, did you always have a passion for comic books or comic strips or anything like that? Or?
I definitely did. So I was, I suspect I'm a little older than you. And so I was, but what they would now call, or would have called a Marvel zombie growing up. And so when I was, and basically I probably collected every comic that Marvel put out from, let's say, 83 to 89 or something like that. That was my period. And I just loved that stuff. Before that, I had, grown up with the newspapers. Now that's an old fashioned idea, but the newspapers of every Sunday, sort of reading comic strips. And I kind of aged with a certain history of the medium. I mean, I can talk about this on this podcast because these are people who know. So at almost precise, I was 13 in 1986. So at almost precisely the moment when I was like, this is getting a little bit, maybe a little juvenile, whatever, right? There was Dark Knight, there was Watchmen. I come from a Jewish background. There was also Mouse was coming out, and that was very important to me as a kid as well. And then I went to college. I read a little bit less. Even with that stuff. And then when I was in graduate school, people were like, you have to check out these Vertigo line of titles. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And and then I started coming back to it and I never really left. And then I started, after a couple of years after that, I started teaching this class. But that was really when I sort of, so I've been very lucky, I should say, that I kind of grew up with a certain kind of history of the medium. So it's been a lifelong love.
That's awesome. I mean, it's kind of funny how a number of people I talk to have this like early childhood love for comics, and then it gets to the point where it's too juvenile. Like it's becomes this. I'm too adult. I need to be more, 18, 19 years old. Need to be more of an adult person. And comic books I need to leave behind. But then there seems like that ebb and flow where it comes back to them. Like, no, I don't care what. It's not juvenile. But there's also, I think, over the number of years have been created, like you mentioned, with the Vertigo line. A lot of your Image or independent lines are very adult comic books, not adult as in like inappropriately adult, but like adult as in, I'm reading Something's Killing the Children right now. And it's an adult comic book. It's not a comic book that's for kids. That's not juvenile, obviously. There are these things, and that's something that you're going to go over. You go over that there's a wide variety of comic books out there that people just immediately jump to, the funny books and the idea that this thing is juvenile or kid. There's some serious storylines that come out in comic books nowadays.
I think that's exactly right. And I do wonder whether or not that ebb and flow that you talk about, that's definitely out there, is going to be, or what is going to be a historical sort of phenomenon. That is, when in my age, in the mid 80s, right, you could say, look, at least if you're talking about what we could call mainstream Marvel DC type comic books, it was a little juvenile. I don't even think the people publishing in Marvel and DC would have disagreed necessarily with that assessment. I mean, you could have found, if you went to a comic store, you could have found comics that were more mature in the way that you're describing them. But it was harder to find those things. Nowadays, I don't think anyone at any point is going to say there are not comics out there in the comic medium that are not adult, that are not, you just will it's like going to be like novels, right? Where you're going to graduate from kids novels to something that's sort of for an older audience, but that's going to be available all the way in a way that I think it wasn't a generation and a half ago, let's say.
I like to say this. So some of it is that it's become more mainstream in the idea of movies. I mean, movies have made this world. I mean, we're all, sadly, a lot of people would rather watch it on a screen than read it on a book, and but that's also helped. I feel like it's helped the comic book industry. It's helped. I mean, writing a book 15, 20 years ago about comic books, it probably wouldn't have been nearly as successful as this book will probably be because of the mainstreamness of comic books. I would think, the book to me, it jumps out on me when I see it on these different lists. There hasn't been a ton to me. Like, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I do read some books, but like a lot of the ones that jump out, I'm like, I want to find another book like that one about comic books. And it ends up being just another story told from a different person of the history of Marvel Comics. And so with this book, it seems like it gives me the gauntlet. It gives me everything that I want to know about the comic book industry over the 150 years that you mentioned.
Well, Justin, I mean, thank you so much for saying that, because that was really, in some sense, my goal was both for, deep fans of one particular aspect of the comics medium, or people who were like they are just interested in culture, as all of us are, and just say, this is an essential part of our culture. I don't know that much about it. I'd like to read a book that just says what it's about. And I also felt, well, there wasn't quite a book that was like that, and that was the kind of book that I wanted to write. So it means a lot to me that you really have got it. You've grokked the kind of essence of what it was that I was trying to do here, and I hope other people will feel the same way. I do. Thank you.
Yeah, and so when I talked a few weeks ago or recently to two writers of a book, a graphic novel about free speech, and to me it's like a serious topic that got me into, like, if I always say in this podcast, anybody who listens to this podcast knows that I got into comic books because I couldn't read very well, and it was like somewhere to mix pictures along with text in a short storyline that's 20 or 30 pages long that gets a beginning and an ending. Yes, it might have a ongoing storyline, but I can get something out of this one book. And so I mentioned these gentlemen about how the graphic novel aspect of something with serious background to it, like a free speech thing, made it huge for me. Because I mean, if I was younger and read this book, it would have been a massive success to me, and I would have learned all kinds of things about free speech and so on, because I got this graphic novel part of it. So like I mentioned, it has all these different books out there. There's even that nowadays, where people are writing graphic novels about things as serious as free speech. And I'm just excited to see where comics is going. The funny thing about writing a history book about comic books is that it's never going to end. Like, you could add a second novel of this, in 30 or 40 years, you could finish up with a follow-up novel or a follow-up book because of all the things that have happened between when you finish this book and the next book.
I think that's right. I was finishing off the book, because at some point you have to send it to press, like you're saying, right? You just have to do it, and it was right in the opening months of COVID, and conventions, were getting canceled, right? The comic book stores were saying, we don't know what's going to happen. We're putting out our product sort of on the sidewalks for people to pick up. We're trying, and you were saying, well, who knows, right? Who knows what's going to happen? Am I going to have to? And it turns out, thankfully, that it seems like the business is doing well, and and all that. But who knew? But as you say, if I write a revised version 20 years from now, there's always that story. If you pick a date and you say, 1954, right after the seduction of the, and you say, oh, that's going to be it for comics. Like, who would know, right? Or whatever it is. Or the internet in 2002. Oh, the internet's going to destroy it. No one's going to read a comic on paper ever again. But what's amazing, as you're saying, is that like 100%, there are all of these serious topics that are in comics. They're for adults. They're for kids. My kids go to school. In their school library, in their public library, there are shelves and shelves of graphic novels on heroes of American history, on forgotten figures, on how to do this or that. People are just going to grow up saying, this is a medium that we use to do everything, along with other media. And I think we're not, and I mean this in the best possible way, right? We're not coming back from that. That's going to stay, yeah. I think.
How long have you been working on this project? I mean, you said it released in the beginning of November. Like, how long was the whole beginning to ending, the inception to now?
I would say I was writing for about 4 years. So even in those 4 years, before I wrote, just to take an example, before I wrote it, when I started writing Black Panther, the movie hadn't come out. We were talking about sort of, how the movies and the TV, Marvel Studios was still doing very, very, very well, but the streaming had not quite taken the same kind of robust thing that it had now. Comics had already begun to win all sorts of prizes for in sort of august literary precincts, but there were more Newbery prizes and MacArthur Genius Grants and things like that in the interim. So a lot of trends that I was beginning to see had intensified to such an extent where I think a lot of people sort of felt now it's impossible not to be in American culture and not think about comics in a serious and profound way. So I'm glad that worked out.
I mean, obviously you have you have four or five books also on top of this one? Or?
Yeah, this is my fifth nonfiction book. Yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, obviously it's a daunting task in the beginning to just set out to actually start to do this, but once you get rolling, is it just one of those things you just dive right into, and it's what your main focus is, other than teaching, obviously, in your spare time, is just trying to figure out how to lay it out and so on and so forth. Was it all you, or is there other people that you have, researchers or?
I had one or two sort of research assistants who helped gather some of the material, particularly someone named Tiffany Babb, who is actually a comics creator in her own right and is very involved and writes for comics. Wonderful, wonderful person. Will have a tremendous career. Tiffany will. But a lot of that is gathering the material. And so the interesting thing is, how to tell the story. I mean, this book originally, as hard as it is to believe, this book was much longer, or it could have been much. But there are things, you have to sort of file away all of the things that don't sort of serve the story that you're telling. And then things that you love kind of get lost a little bit in the mix, but nothing can cover absolutely everything, as much as I might have tried. You take a lot of time. I mean, I thanked in the acknowledgments lots of members of the Columbia University library system, because every day I would kind of pull up and I would say, here's 20 books from the library that I want to take out. Here's another 20 that I need you to order from various precincts around the country. And the library was amazing in helping out. There's a woman named Karen Green, who you may also know, who's the Columbia University librarian for comics, and we have one for comics, and has just been amazing in helping out. So,
but that says something right there, that Columbia University has a focus on the comic book aspect of literature and the medium of picture books. To the point where graphic novels and comics can end up in special places like that. You talk about MacArthur Genius Grants and all these things that come out of a picture book, which is just fascinating to see. And I get, for the rest of your life, anybody who's a comic book fan is going to get not ridiculed, but we're going to be picked on a little bit, because it's the fact that, why don't you read a real book, or why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? But it's getting to the point now where, I mean, I'm a 35, so I was born in 86 when you were talking about right in the middle of the Marvel love. But I am a tattooed person, and all of them, basically, except for one that's on this arm, is an piece of artwork that I drew, is all comic book stuff. And so, I don't think that you talk about 18-year-old Justin or 17-year-old Justin in high school would have admitted to, when I turned 18 getting my first tattoo, that I would have been like, oh yeah, I'm going to get some comic book related because that's cool. People are going to love me for that. No, I was trying to hide my comic book love because I wanted to be a cool person, and comic books weren't cool at the time. Now it's just, I proudly would display the book about American comics on a shelf and show it off to people. I have things like you said, I see behind me in my living room. My wife has, made some, she's forgiven me a little bit, but there's some pictures on the wall. There's two pieces of artwork in our living room that are original pieces of artwork that I loved having, that are comic book related, but I don't overbear her. I don't put it in too much in the house. But I wouldn't have thought about that back when I was in high school, that comics would have been a cool thing to do. Now, this kind of a book, I'd give it to a young, 18, 19-year-old and be like, hey, read this book about how my love for comic books was created in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think it's also very funny that, we've been talking a little bit about sort of the adaptations, right, where there is even this sort of cool aspect of saying, well, I knew about these things before they were sort of plastered over the multiplexes, right? Oh, you like that? You should read the original run, because the original run actually is right. You can have that kind of dynamic, right? Which certainly when I was growing up, I think, as you say, even when you were growing up, really that was not the case. But now it is sort of part of the lingua franca of American culture, in a way that it was, I should say, as a historian, 100 years ago, right? I mean, if you had said in 1925 or 1935 to someone, oh, I'm keeping up with the latest comic strips, nobody would say, oh, I can't believe it, right? Everyone would say, oh, I guess you're an American citizen then, right? I guess that's just, you live in America. That's what you do. That's also part of this historical ebb and flow too. There was a point sort of in the 1960s with the countercultural things, that to read comics was also to be associated with a certain kind of cool rebelliousness. Marvel tried that for half a minute with the Marvel pop art stuff, this is one of the nice things about being a cultural historian, is that you watch these trends and these moments. But I'm glad we're in a moment that we're in right now. It's fantastic for all of us who are fans.
It's more recently, I was just thinking about the different risks that comic book creators are taking with adding in substantially risque topics of same-sex marriages and race and all those drugs and all this other stuff. I mean, drugs has been one of those ones that has been tried to put into comic books, back in the early DC early a few number of years ago, DC days of putting a cover of someone shooting up on the cover of the book, and Comics Code obviously wouldn't allow it originally. But nowadays, it seems like they're taking these risks in taking these big subjects of race and religion and same sex and all this other stuff, which is something that's groundbreaking in a sense as well, because again, it's such a part of culture nowadays to see that too. So it's just love to see the expansion and the growth of comic books in the first place. But getting back on the writing of the book, the question I have is, why all comics? Why not just picking a superheroes or Marvel or DC? Was there just you wanted to get it all out there and cover the whole thing, or was there because I mean, to me personally, I don't know if it's just me being lazy, but I would have been like, okay, I'm going to pick Marvel and go with Marvel and write about Marvel, and then maybe I'll do another book about DC and maybe another one about the origin of 150 years ago. But was it just like there is a story to tell the whole thing?
I think you put it exactly right there. I think that one of the things that I really loved was finding all the connections that really came out when you treated this as a full story, right? Rather than when you look at Alan Moore, let's say, and you look at him growing up and you say, this is a guy who read a ton of underground comics and actually started doing a comic strip that owed a lot to Art Spiegelman before Mouse, right? But when he was doing sort of some of his underground strips, Alan Moore was also a cartoonist, right? And he did his own sort of comic strip called Roscoe Moscow, if I remember correctly.
It's very easy to say,
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And so that's an example, right? Or when you see the people who did Love and Rockets, and they say, what we loved was Archie, right? Which is not surprising if you look at that kind of work, right? Or you see the Undergrounders when they start, they say, well, we loved EC and Walt Disney comics as a kid, and then we sort of parodied them, and we did all these things with. So if you only sort of focus on one of the stories, you can tell sort of some wonderful things by doing that. There's no question. But you're missing out in some ways on some of the broad history and tapestry and some of the richness of what those artists and writers bring to the table. Because almost all of these writers and artists are huge lovers of the medium. They're not just reading they're only their style of comic books, as it turns out. They're reading sort of lots of different things, and it all comes into the mix. And so, as a historian and a critic, I thought that was very interesting and very important to kind of tell. So it was a little bit more work. I'm not going to lie. It was, but I think that it paid off, not just in terms of for the reader, the kind of you get to know a lot more, and you get to find a lot more stuff that you might be interested in, but also in terms of the understanding that I brought to my own understanding of these individual comics.
So it's funny. I am happy about it, and not to like pat you on the back this whole podcast episode, but okay. I'm happy about it because I'm a big Marvel fan. Most of my reading is Marvel comics. I don't want to make your teacher at Columbia also mad. I never actually read a DC comic ever. It just happened to be that when I was younger, my dad, when I was sick, would bring me home like a ginger ale and a Marvel comic book. And I don't know if it would just happen to be what he grabbed off the shelf or whatever was available. That was obviously back when it was more available at newsstands and in convenience stores and things like that. And so Marvel just became my love. And then I started getting more entrenched in Marvel because I'd say, people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all these people created these characters that live in my world. Mm-hmm. You're in New York City. You can look out your window right there and see Spider-Man swoop by. That's huge to me. You don't live in Gotham. There's no such thing as Gotham. So that always to me. So I've never read a DC comic book, but I've read Marvel my entire life. Excuse me. But so because of that, I've become a big Marvel fan and entrenched in Marvel, and more recently, more indie stuff too, is that I would only pick up a book based on the fact of the history of Marvel. I've read a couple of biographies of Stan Lee. I've read some books about Marvel versus DC. But reading a book that's about all comics in general gives you a bigger perspective of it. Almost forces me to read about other companies or other mediums of comics into as well. Whereas if I just pick up a book about Marvel, I'm going to learn about Marvel over again, which is the exact same stories over and over and over again. So I do appreciate that because it forces those who would love comic books like myself into learning about comics in general, not just the maybe the publisher that you read the most.
Right. And and it makes you go back and look at some of those comics that you love, that we love, differently. So, for example, once I started reading about this genre called romance comics, right, that really flourished kind of in the late '40s and the very early '50s, right, that and that Jack Kirby was very involved in. He was one of the creators, in fact, you could say, of the genre with Joe Simon. And then you read a lot of the love triangles that populate early Marvel comics, you say, wow, that's a lot in the DNA. There's a lot of romance comic in the DNA, even though these comics are not romance comics, right? But, it's not that Iron Man is a romance comic, but there are love triangles there. There's all, and so, you really think, wow, this is all part of that kind of story. The more you read of those sort of horror and science fiction and monster comics from the 1950s, you look at Fantastic Four #1 and you say, oh, well, who are they fighting? They're fighting a monster that could have appeared on any kind of cover from the last 10 years of comics history. And that's a lot of, and then, conversely, in the 70s or the 80s, reading sort of this Marvel comics, you're when you're reading sort of these politicized alternative and counterculture comics next to them, you're saying, oh, here's where they're trying a little bit within the confines of the comics code to take on some of those issues in their kind of way. And it's fun to kind of see those stories coming together in that way and go back to comics that I loved as a kid and say, oh, actually there's something here that's part of that bigger story. And it's not just what I grew to love, like you, I think, is the kind of real life universe of the Marvel comics and the kind of the grand web, to use Spider-Man, right? But the grand web of all of these things together of saying, okay, well, since I'm collecting all 14 titles or whatever it was at that point, Rom the Space Knight is going to appear in the X-Men, and that's all part of the same story or whatever it was.
And more recently, Mike, I normally have a co-host on here too, Adam, but he had a prior engagement, so you couldn't join us today. But him and I have talked about how dark and gritty DC has become too. Like it's very, 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 very dark. It's very, very there's no color in it at all. Whereas Marvel is a little bit more poppy and more like there's darkness too. I mean, we have a series that gets out right now that came out Wednesday. The third issue came out called Dark Ages, and it's very dark. But like to me, it's more, I don't know. We live in such a dark world right now. Like we live in such the pandemic and all the other stuff that's going on in the world right now. I'm like, I kind of want to get escapism to something where it's a little bit more like, I don't know, bubbly in a sense. And so that's one of the reasons why Marvel has become also my go-to thing. As I said earlier, though, I'm also reading a book called Something's Killing the Children about a monster killing children. So,
that's a great title, though. That's a great comics. James Tinian the fourth, he's a great writer.
I feel like out of that group of books that I'm reading right now, I think there's at least two of them that are by him, because I'm also reading Department of Truth, which is the conspiracy theory book that's out there, which is amazing. And he's also writing that. And it's like, this guy's hitting home runs like no tomorrow right now.
Yeah. I mean, every so often, you feel like there are a couple of writers that really sort of epitomize the age. And I think he's one of those. He's right up there. And I think that, one of the other stories I tell in the book is, and I mentioned Something is Killing the Children very briefly in the book because it had just started, I think, when I was finishing. But is horror as a genre, which is such, again, a mirror of American society. What we fear is part of who we are. And so comics, are always jumping on that to the extent that they can within, the code approved institutions or what have you. And I think that's right. But one of the things that we always used to play as kids is Superman versus Batman. And in some ways, as a metaphor, Batman has won in the DC precincts right now, right? It's all grim and gritty, and it's much less of the sort of delight of being a Superman in a certain way. And that pendulum may swing again, who knows? But that's where we are right now. And I think Marvel has always been a little bit better at having sort of a kind of delightful ironic comedy in their comics, and it comes to their movies as well, I think, in many cases. that
Uh,
right now these, yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
on the horror side of this too, I listened to a podcast called Off Panel. He's a great podcast on the internet right now. But he had a guest on there talking. I mean, it might have been when James Tynion was on there, honestly, but talking about how hard it is kind of to write a horror comic book in a sense that, I mean, when you open a comic book, an actual book, you read it and you see that you just see words, so that you don't skip across the next page to see what the words on the next page are. You just look at the first bit word and you read it. That's a comic book. You kind of open up and you take in the whole landscape. And so like you open up the next page and you flip the next page, like it has to have whatever jump scare or scary thing in the book has to be in that top left corner of the book, because you can't put it on the bottom right corner, because you're obviously going to know, if you just stare at the entire image, you're going to know in the bottom right corner what's happening, and so on. So you have to write the book and draw the book and lay out the book in a way that when you flip the page is when you get the scary thing, the horror part, and the rest of it just tells the rest of that story. Then, oh, there it is again. Because of that, it makes it a little bit more difficult to actually write a horror book than maybe a superhero book or some other book on the market, because again, jump scares in movies, you don't see that. It happens. Jump scares in comic books, again, a lot of us cheat. We open it up, we take the whole landscape in, and we're like, oh, guess that person dies. Oops. So writing those, I mean, obviously it is difficult in some sense to write a comic book in the first place, but I feel like horror books are one of those ones that are taking off, and you have to have a specific mindset and way of laying it out to actually get it done right.
I think you're 100% right that layout is the key to a horror book, even in some way. I mean, it's the key to every comic book, but it's the key even more to a horror comic book. And at the same time, that it's almost like a sonnet, that the restrictions can create power, right? So on the one hand, you have this thing, like you're saying, you're gonna lose the effect, but this thing of saying, I know that the next page is gonna scare the crap out of me, and I don't want to turn that page, but I have to turn that page, but I don't want to. And then you turn the page, and it's like a double page spread of something horrific. I'm thinking particularly of the one of the first issues of Garth Ennis's and Jason Burroughs' Crossed, which is hardcore, right? I mean, this is not for your casual horror fan. But there's one double. I'm not going to explain it to the reader. I will leave it for them to be terrified. But you turn and there's a huge double page spread, and as bad as you thought it was going to be, it's much worse. And it's just I that page haunts me sort of sometimes at night. But you're 100% right that that's the beauty of comics, is to say this is a special medium. It's a unique medium and has its own sort of gifts and its own sort of challenges. And the masters who work it well, they can do amazing things. The other thing of horror, for example, is what you do when you don't show. Comics is a visual medium, so you have to show stuff, but you can use shadows, you can use things that are hidden or half hidden, you can pause with multiple panel breakups and all of that can with the hands of the real masters of the craft, can really sort of create a kind of effect that's even different from the movie one, because the movie one, like, you have to go at the rate that the movie goer shows. And here they can kind of slow it up and speed it up, that kind of thing. So I agree with you. Horror, the black diamond of skiing of
yes. And that's when you just mentioned James Tynion, the fourth. The same thing with him. He has that ability to do that. And the same thing I had with Department of Truth, which is a conspiracy theory book. It's the same idea where, like, you don't know what's going to happen. And it's like one of those, like, he has to do it on that certain layout and so on. But there's just this, to get to the whole overall subject here, there's a wide, vast variety of comic books that are out there for anybody. There really is a book now for any reader. And that's to the point where there's a young kid, the adventures comic books that are out there, to, Something's Killing the Children, or some other really deep horror book, to superheroes, to all that stuff. And it all started like 150 years ago, like you mentioned, when comic strips and things like that were starting to put out there. I mean, honestly, they're probably there's probably comic book strips on walls of caves somewhere, honestly, but someone who's telling some sort of superhero story on a wall somewhere, but in hieroglyphics or something. But there is
those cave paintings of the going after the buffalo. You just have to put a cape on some of those people who are facing down these big animals. You're 100% right. It's a story.
So some of them are more superheroes than actual superheroes we have nowadays. I mean, Batman just wears a cape and a cowl, and Iron Man wears an iron suit. They're not actually powerful. I mean, maybe those cave dwellers were superheroes as well, in their own right.
Yeah,
the damsel in distress.
It's an amazing long story, and I'm very happy I got a chance to tell some chunk of it, in the book.
And so just quickly as we round this up too, I wanted to talk. You do events too. You do like lectures and things like that. I mean, obviously, COVID's really stopped you from doing that. Are you going to get it back into doing that some more? Are you going to do some about comic books as well, or is this?
I really hope so. I hope I'm gonna get a chance to do some conventions sort of later in the year, and individual lectures and events. I'm doing one online for the National Archives in December, which could be very cool. Given my sort of comic book brain, I kind of imagine using it like to try and break it and steal the Declaration of Independence or something like that. But I'm doing it. I'm doing it on Zoom, so I think that's unlikely. But I'm doing that December 13th, and I hope to be doing more events. People can check out my website, which is jeremydauber.com. It's not so fancy for upcoming events, or follow me on Twitter. And the book is on sale everywhere.
Everywhere. And so yeah, you can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it. Is there links on your website? I'm guessing too.
Absolutely.
Well.
Thank you. Yeah, there are links. I'm not quite as good at this yet, so thank you for helping me out. There are links on my website. You can buy it wherever you buy books, both online and in person. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I thought it makes a good holiday gift. So
yeah, I was just gonna say it's perfect timing, honestly, because there's a couple of books that are coming out in this month that I've talked to a few people, or even like DVDs or things like that. It's like someone out there is pretty smart about when these books come out, because they do seem like a pretty good book for a comic book fan out there, or someone who's just into history. Honestly, like you mentioned, maybe it's someone who's into history who isn't really into comics, but this might break the mold on them and get them into comic books in the first place.
Yeah, I've been doing a bunch of radio interviews, and many of them are with people who are not as well versed as you. But what's amazing to me is that every single person, there hasn't been one person yet who hasn't started with something like, "Oh, I loved this," and it's one aspect of it, right? It's and they're different. Many of them are different. A lot of them are peanuts, as it turns out. But many of them, which is not a bad choice, right? But they're all everybody. Nobody's like, I have nothing to do with any kind of comics ever, right? Nobody has ever said that yet, and I can't imagine it's gonna be. Everybody's got their way into the story. So
yeah, it's funny how you mentioned the peanuts part, but like when I talk to other people about comics, a lot of times I ask them what got them into comics, and they start saying, in the 80s or 90s, I started watching this, and then it always eventually sometimes people talk about the X-Men cartoon that was on Fox back in the day, and so it's funny how there's always this different ways people got into comics, but there's a lot of times that one cartoon always comes back to the story. So like the Peanuts thing could be like all these different ways you got into it. Peanuts is really the thing that got me going into whatever comics thing there is. And they're actually going to be redoing that the X-Men series. Disney Plus just announced they're going to do it, and they're going to bring it back to the 1990s style. Actors and actresses are going to be on it that were on the first one. It's crazy. They're definitely going this nostalgic route.
I just, I have a grand sort of cultural theory. This is not just about comics, right? That when you get to a position, let's say, in your late 30s, your early 40s of power in the Hollywood hierarchy, all you want to do is have your hands on the thing that you loved when you were a kid, right? And who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't? I would do it too. And so, Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg are like, we love this Vertigo stuff. We're gonna do it. And this is what's happening now. Everyone's like, X-Men 97. That's what we're,
yes.
So that's my.
It's funny. I mean, it just happened this past. We were recording this on a Monday, but over the past weekend, they released Ghostbusters Afterlife, and I was listening to a podcast. Or was it this weekend? Yeah, or maybe it was the weekend before that. And Ghostbusters Afterlife came out, and the guys from this podcast I listened to, Kevin Smith's podcast, we're talking about how it's nostalgic lip service. It's like service to the people who just want to learn about watch another Ghostbusters movie. Like the whole movie is just like servicing those people on the nostalgic of it, and it's a lot of that nowadays. It's just people want to live in the nostalgic part of it, and like you mentioned, it's that getting to play with the things that you grew up with, and bringing it out to people as you get older, which is awesome. So, and you get to play in comic books, which is awesome too. And now you're going to sell thousands and millions of books, of this book, just from this podcast alone.
I will take it. And this is an amazing conversation, and it's so great to be on the podcast. Thank you you're such a great interview. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So Jeremy Dauber, is that how you say your last name? Yeah. .com, Tauber, Jeremy, spelled like Jeremy, like the normal person. My brother's name is Jeremy, so I know that one. And you can find him on Twitter and buy his book, because American Comics, A History, right? Is that the name of it? Yes. And we'll put links in the pages and all that stuff so you guys can purchase it too. I really appreciate you coming on, Jeremy, and talking to us about your book and just talking about comics in general. We'll have to have you on again when you write your second book about comic books, right?
I'd love that. That'd be fantastic. Thank
When
you.
the revised edition comes out, we'll talk, in 20 years.
That sounds great. I'll look forward to it. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, happy holidays to you and happy new year. And I hope the book is a super success. And again, people go out there and buy that book. Shop local if you can. Local bookstores need your help as well. But if you can't, order it online because, you need a copy of this book for your family for holidays. So thanks again, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you.